What's up, guys? Welcome to the Fitness Pain Free Show. And today we have a very special guest, Dean Somerset. Dean, what's going on?
Feeling very special up in here. Glad
Mm.
to be on board and glad to finally have a chance to connect on the podcast.
Yeah, Dean, you are special. So you definitely deserve to come on here and feel special. So,
There we go.
well,
Special like a snowflake.
for sure. We got a bunch of really cool stuff to talk about today. Mostly, we're going to talk about how to stay fit and healthy lifelong with your weight training, how not to hurt yourself and get all the positives and none of the negatives for the most part. What do you think about that?
Sounds like a game plan, man. That's kind of like a reason we wrote a book about that kind of subject, right?
We did write a book about that, but more on that in a little bit. So I just wanted to introduce you a little bit, Dean. So Dean, if you go on his website and look at his bio, he doesn't talk himself up very much, but I'll talk him up a little bit. I think it's funny because when I first met Dean, I would say a couple years ago, something along those lines, I felt like I knew you for a long time because I've been following your stuff for probably about 15 to 20 years, something like that. Am I right there?
Yeah, pretty close to that. I think I started my blog in 2008. So I've been
Blogs, right?
in the
Back
game
when
for
we
a long
consumed.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty
Back when
good.
we
And
wrote words.
yeah, back in the day. And one of the things that drew me to your stuff was that you were into weight training and you're a self-proclaimed meathead, which I also identify as meathead. And you also were trying to stay healthy, right? So it was kind of this idea of getting jacked, but also not hurting yourself, right? Which I think is really cool. And obviously, I'm a physical therapist, and my whole career has changed to the point where I do care about fitness, but also staying healthy and rehabilitation. So I feel like you influenced me a lot early on. And I read a lot of your content, a lot of T Nation, and then you worked a little bit with Tony Gentilcore over the course of the year, doing shoulder stuff, hip stuff, and I consumed some of that. You're also an author. You've been published in a couple of different books right now. You've spoken nationally and internationally. Currently,
Yeah.
you live in Canada. Very warm this time of year, from what I hear. Not at all. It's negative 25, I think you had said. And
Yep.
so you've spoken internationally. Have you been? I know you've been out in Europe. Have you been in the States much? Have you been in the
Yeah, quite
States
a bit
much
through
speaking?
North America, a lot through Europe, and yeah, quite a bit. Tony and I have taught workshops in like LA, Seattle, Washington, New York, Boston, St. Louis, Chicago. So I'm all over the place.
Yeah. So you've been everywhere. Pretty cool. Yeah. And the second
Try to,
reason,
man. That's one of the cool parts about the job.
yeah, yeah. So obviously, Dean practices what he preaches. He works, trains himself. He's been training others for years and years. We're in this kind of social media place nowadays where you can be an expert within like 6 months just by posting really, really good content on social media. And it's not how we were kind of raised, that you had to practice what you preach and go in the trenches and work hard and kind of earn your stripes. It's not that way anymore, but I feel like Dean has kind of done that. So I really appreciate him as an author. You know what I mean? And I want to say it was around 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, Tony Gentilcore approached me and asked if I wanted to be an author on a book with you through human kinetics. And the whole idea is we want to try to produce something that was for weightlifters who really cared about obviously getting jacked and getting strong, all those awesome things that come with strength training, but also staying healthy, right? And you were an author, and they asked if I wanted to be a co-author, and that would be the kind of the physical therapy stamp of approval, the strength training is good or not, right? So we got busy
Hmm.
and we basically produced a book, Rock Solid Resiliency. And this book is actually going to be available February 28th on Amazon. It's actually available right now, but you can't get it. It's all pre-order at this point. But I'll put a link in the description if you guys want to check it out a little later. Anything to say about the book so far, Dean?
I mean, this has always been a goal of mine, is to be able to write something. So to be able to have my name on the cover of a book, always been a lifelong goal. And I'm sure that was something that was kind of a big goal of yours as well. Even if it's something where it's going to sell one copy or a million copies, I'm not as concerned about that. It's more about the fact that this was just an accomplishment to get done. To be able to do something where I was able to co-author with you was a huge honor too. Being able to see your career develop and expand, but at the same time, just having people who know what they're talking about, being able to provide content that people can digest so easily is going to be just a massive game changer for a lot of people I know who are able to pick up this book.
Yeah, I'm pumped as well. This is kind of a lifelong goal too. I've never worked with a publisher before, and Human Connects has been great so far, kind of guiding us, kind of showing us the ropes and, showing us what to do. Have
Hmm.
not seen a physical copy of the book yet, although I'm excited for it. They should be publishing, I think, as we speak, almost, right?
Yeah,
They'll be shipping out pretty dang soon. So I'm excited to share some of that. So make sure you follow us on our social media. I wanted to kick this off with a little bit of a discussion of what actually leads to injury, because I think as folks who enjoy weight training, one of the biggest problems, and I think we start to see this probably in our 30s, 40s, as we start to age up a little bit. Your 20s, basically, you can do whatever the heck you want to do. You can party all night, you can drink, you can train as hard as you like, and your body doesn't break. And eventually things start to break, and that stinks. And you can't really do the things that you love to do. And now you're making a million modifications at the gym. You can't deadlift anymore. You can't bench press because your shoulder hurts. It's just kind of a big pain in the butt. And I think for the average lifter, one of the most important lessons is to figure out, why do these injuries actually occur in the first place? So I wanted to chit chat a little bit about that. I did write the chapter on this. Do you want to jump in and start anywhere, Dean? You want me to just start rattling off some of these things I think are important for lifters?
sure. I mean, the biggest thing to consider with injuries is that something had to give. Your body was exposed to some level of stress, the tissue couldn't manage it effectively, and it either got overstretched, it got damaged, it got torn, something happened where the tissue just wasn't able to manage the stress that was being applied to it. Now, the challenge with that is that exercise is stress to the tissues. We have to apply enough stress to see positive adaptation, but we don't necessarily know how much stress that is until after the fact. And we don't necessarily know whether the person is going to be able to respond good or bad in the first application of that stress until we've got a couple more repeated exposures to be able to figure that out. So it's kind of a roll in the dice anytime you do anything physically active. And like you said, there's a ton of other variables in there. Like if you're young, you can do a whole bunch of things, bounce back really quickly. Your tissue's ability to recover is really solid and really fast. If you get 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, tissue recovery is way slower and more gradual. So what you can recover from when you're 20, I've got some clients that are elite track cyclists who come into the gym and they're like, I want to max out every single day. And for them, they can throw max weight on the bar, do a front squat, grind it out, and come back tomorrow and do the exact same thing tomorrow because they're concerned about, I want to bump my numbers up all the time. And they can get away with that. With my 70 and 80-year-old clients, if we want to push some numbers, it's like a 4 or 5 week cycle to get them into a heavy lift and then 4 or 5 weeks to get them into the next heavy lift. It's not something where we can just do day to day to day because they're just going to get beat up, feel bad, and not want to keep coming back to the gym. It's not something that we can really manage all that well. So tissue adaptation to stress is really a weird concept because you have to stress it. But if you stress it just too much, then you start seeing injury or breakdown. And you don't know where that line is until you cross it.
Mm-hmm. I always like to tell folks you're kind of like fighting fire with fire, right? Obviously, fire can burn you, but it also can cook you a nice hamburger. So you have to have that right dosage, right? I
Hmm.
completely agree with you. One of the things that I think happens in the world of fitness is that we deem things either like dangerous or not dangerous. At the end of the day, you can hurt yourself doing anything, and strength training is no different. So we definitely do see some injuries here. We know kind of where they occur. It seems like most folks in, let's say, strength sports or just people that are active in the gym tend to have more shoulder issues, knee issues, and low back issues. So we're always kind of on the lookout for those types of injuries. And if you know what the most common injuries are in your given activity, then you can come up with some sort of way to prevent those things, right?
To a
Now,
point, yeah. But then
yeah.
things happen. Like the other day, I was shampooing and I threw my back out. Like stuff happens. I've had times where I've like pulled a shoulder sleeping weird, or
Yeah.
like just doing chores around the house, my knee gets a little bit sore. It's like, what are
Yeah.
all of these things? It's not like it's a new stress or really major. Maybe I'm just getting really old, but things happen. We can manage stress to a certain point, but then the body is like, you know what, we're just going to accumulate everything and then we're going to hold a grudge until you actually do something about it. And if you don't do something about it properly, we're going to let you know. It's like
Yeah.
the ultimate abusive, toxic relationship.
I know. I always say that the the body is a great teacher, right? When you get an injury, it teaches you something. Maybe you did something wrong, or maybe you had too much stress in your life, whatever it is. But you walk away with that, hopefully with some sort of positive, as opposed to just being mad about being hurt. But for
Mhm.
sure, the next thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about, Dean, is technique. So technique to me is really funny in a rehab sense, just because I would say that in the past 10 to 15 years, technique was like the most important thing. If you don't have perfect technique, that's why you get hurt. And what I will say, and I think this is also in the rehab world, the pendulum has swung. It's gone to this point of like technique is the most important thing. So technique doesn't matter. As long as you slowly ramp into it, you can do whatever the heck you want to do. And my belief is that there's probably some gray there, right? So technique is probably going to be relevant, but there's also going to be some sort of truth to the fact that you can gradually load things over the course of time, and probably different techniques are probably okay. Do you have any thoughts from this perspective, Dean?
Absolutely. I've always used exercise technique very much like cooking. So if you want to just slap together a meal and eat it, you're going to be fine. As long as it's cooked enough so you like reach that food safety component, you're good. But if you want to make a specific recipe and get a specific outcome, you have to follow the recipe. So if I have a client who's doing a row and like a bent over dumbbell row, and I say, what muscles do you feel working when you do that? And they're like, oh, I feel my neck and my traps. They shouldn't be feeling that. Technique is off. We're not getting the desired outcome of what we're looking for with that exercise. Now, if I'm doing a row specifically to make my traps get stronger, for one, I got to give my head a shake. It's like, why am I doing that when the row should be feeling more of your lats? It's a different place than your traps. If you want the traps to actually feel work, cool, go for it. But if you want your lats to work and the person's giving you feedback and saying, I don't feel my lats, then they're not getting the benefit you're looking for from the exercise. So you have to change the technique to get the benefit. What we know when we look at things like a deadlift, yeah, you have a variable degree of what you can accomplish with different technique. But still, if you deadlift with a rounded back, lumbar vertebrae is exposed to way more force than if you have a deadlift with a flat back. That doesn't necessarily mean a rounded back is good or bad. It just means it's more force. So if a person has a predisposed low back injury from excessive force on that area, I want to try to minimize that to a degree so that I don't keep beating them up and breaking them down. But also, I want to make their legs do the work. I don't want their spine to do the work. I want their legs to. Elite powerlifters are not Jeff from accounting who's trying to recover from 3 disc herniations and wants to be able to tie his shoes again. So context is important, but also what is the reason that you're using that technique and what's the desired outcome? I mean, you can't be expecting to make chocolate chip cookies if you're throwing like everything into the pot and then out comes the steak. It's not really going to be the same thing that you're looking for. Delicious,
Yeah.
but not a cookie.
Steak cookies, my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always think too, like your technique is going to dictate where the stress lies, right? Just like you said. So if you have someone who has a past history of low back pain and you squat West Side style, hips way back, vertical shin, always really heavy, you're just placing
hmm
more strain on the hips and spine than if you just allow those knees to travel forward. And it really depends on our goals. If we're trying to strength train the spine, then yeah, that might be pretty good. But if, Jeff from accounting doesn't handle that load well, then we could probably just bring those knees forward a little bit, squat with the knees forward, get the quads involved, get the legs involved a little bit more, reduce some strain on the spine, and ultimately long term, maybe be a little bit healthier because we're not overdoing it in the back, right?
Yeah.
So,
And it might be something where we do other things to help strengthen the back, but we just don't load it that way to that extent. And we focus on technique in that. But then we do things like a high back extension hold to build up his low back strength. And we get him to do some back extension rows or something like that. Like we can
yeah.
accomplish the same goal in a whole bunch of different ways in the gym, which is the really cool thing. We don't need to be beholden to just one methodology. But at the same time, if I ask a client, what do you feel when you do this? And they tell me something entirely different than what I thought it should be, then we need to change either how they do the exercise, what the exercise is, or find a different way to get that approach that we're looking for because the goal is a specific goal. Let's find that.
Yeah, I'm trying not to segue right now because this would be a nice natural segue to what to do when people get hurt in the gym. But to bring things back a little bit, I want to talk a little about volume of training as well as spikes in volume. And you already mentioned this. So largely, if you have an individual that's new to training, or let's say
Mhm.
they're 7 years old and they just don't handle as much, they're only going to handle a certain finite amount of volume, right? So maybe if you're very young, you handle a lot more. As you age, you handle less and less. And the other piece, your body adapts to things slowly over the course of time, right? And this work was pioneered by Tim Gabbett, but it's really a no-brainer. And it's funny we didn't think about this before. If you throw too much at your body, it's really not prepared for it, your risk of injury just goes up. And this is all the acute to chronic workload ratio stuff that Tim Gaddett has pioneered through his research over the past 10 to 15 years. How do you tackle some of these things with your clients, Dean?
Well, funny enough, Vince Girondo was a big proponent of monitoring volume with his training. That was back in the 70s. And with a lot of the people that he worked with, he was like, you're not increasing your volume greater than 10% week to week basis. And a lot of like elite level tracking field coaches do the same thing. It's like no more than a 10% increase on a week to week basis, because you will get injured. If you go from doing like 5,000 meters in a workout to doing 25,000 meters in a workout, you're going to suck the day after. It's not going to even be like a fun thing. It's going to be like you're going to hurt everywhere, and you're probably going to have some serious repercussions from it. If you go from doing 10 sets of legs to 30 sets of legs, you're going to suck that next day. It's going to not be pleasant whatsoever. So volume monitoring, volume adjustments typically come back to just being like, okay, are you paying attention to what you're actually doing? And are you pushing yourself really hard and fast to see big changes and spikes in volume, big changes and spikes in intensity, or are you doing it in a progressive manner? Like I always follow what the smart people do in the world, and most of them recommend no more than a 10% change in volume on a week basis. When you get into like marathon and ultra marathon, it's down to like 2 to 5% week by week change, because the volumes are just so high and stupid. But at the same time, for the average person, if you do something different, you're going to hurt. If you do more volume, if you do more intensity, you do a different exercise, you do a different way of doing anything, you're going to hurt. If you go on vacation and you walk through the streets in Europe and you do that for 8 hours a day, you're going to hurt, because you're not used to walking for 8 hours a day. So anytime we change anything, if it's an extreme change, it's going to produce greater stress to the body, which is going to make it break down faster than if you have a smaller, more gradual change. So with a lot of my clients, I use training logs, I use training journals. We follow a relatively regimented volume progression, and it might be a couple extra reps on this set, it might be one extra set, it might be one extra exercise, but volume changes are pretty small and slow.
I like it. This next one is going out to Jeff from accounting with the lumbar disc herniations. So I think this is, relatively common knowledge, but one of the biggest risk factors for a future injury is having had a prior injury, right? And one of the big ones is low back pain. So if you get low back pain once, it's very odd if you don't have it again at some point in the future, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, if you have a Jeff from accounting who has a history of low back issues, we have to be careful about West Side seated good mornings, right? With maximal loads. So I think this is something that we can think about when we have an athlete and they come in for, let's say, an intake and we're evaluating them, any history of pain. Yeah, my back has been hurting over and over again. When they come into the gym, we probably have to be really careful about things like squats and deadlifts and the volume in which we throw at them. Any thoughts from that standpoint, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who suffered from repeated back injuries for probably my entire adult lifehood. But at the same time, tissues can adapt to the stress you put them under. Once you've been injured, it does take longer to see positive adaptations at a slower pace than somebody who's had non-injured tissue. Scar tissue doesn't move the same way normal tissue does, and it doesn't remodel the same way. When you break things down and try to build it back up again, there's going to be sensitivity. Some people who've had a previous injury are going to be more sensitive to certain movements, and any irritation to that zone is going to make them feel like hot buttered death. It's going to be awful for them. And at the same time, it's going to be something they're hesitant to lean into harder because they just don't like that feeling. It brings back a lot of PTSD from when they've had previous injuries. Nobody wants to be in pain. Nobody wants to be sick. So when you're training people that have a previous injury, yeah, you got to be a little bit kinder and gentler and be a bit more progressive with it, but also pick exercises that don't beat that area quite so bad, and then get them to go through volume and load progressions that are a little bit easier with maybe a bit more time between progressions to allow them to accommodate to it effectively. You can still do some really cool stuff. Like after multiple disc bulges and tears and ligaments and stuff like that, I've been able to deadlift 500 pounds and do the splits. So you can see positive adaptation, but you have to be a little bit more conscientious about how you do it. It's just got to be something that you give a little bit more forethought to versus just saying YOLO and go for max efforts every day.
Yeah, very smart. I think you kind of hit it from two sides, right? So we have to be a little careful with the at-risk movements. So at least in my opinion, the at-risk movements for folks in the gym with a history of low back pain, it's going to be deadlifting, number one, and then squatting is probably number two. There's some other ones that can give folks some trouble, like bent over rows and maybe some of the Olympic lifts. But I think the big ones are just deadlifting and then squats, right? So one of
Usually,
the
yeah.
things I tend to think about is we can still squat. We just have to be cautious about the application of that stress and probably very, very consistent with it over the course of time. So have a nice, steady, chronic workload with no spikes. And the second piece is I like to try to have an insurance policy, what I call it, right? So essentially, we know the low back has been hurt in the past. It's more likely to get hurt again in the future. Let's get that thing beefed up a little bit with some safer exercise and make it a little bit more robust over the course of time, right? So maybe, Jeff, from accounting, we're not deadlifting multiple times throughout the week. Maybe it's just once. We squat once, maybe twice. We're very careful with the amount of volume. Keep those reps moderate, maybe a little bit higher, so we don't have too much stress or strain on the spine. And then we throw in some accessory exercises 2 or 3 times a week. Maybe that's some additional core work. I like doing a lot of low back strengthening for these folks. So I like 45-degree back extensions. I like GHD back extensions. I like some plate hold good mornings with a tempo. Basic stuff that strengthens the area that doesn't overdo it, right? So we have that insurance policy. So when folks have poor recovery, let's say they are under a lot of stress, not eating well, right? Or they train a little bit too hard, their technique is a little bit off, a little bit shifty or something along those lines. Hopefully they don't get injured, right?
If you guys like what you're learning about so far, then the next logical step is to sign up for the Fitness Pain-Free mini course. I've made an absolutely free mini course, and we go over 4 vital lessons for coaches and clinicians. The first lesson goes over how traditional schooling has failed us. Now, I'm actually a really big fan of education, and I think that physical therapy school actually prepared me pretty well to work with the average person. However, I really didn't learn how to work with the population that I want, which is people in the strength and fitness world. So I'm talking about powerlifting, bodybuilding, Olympic weightlifting, sport of fitness, and really people that just love working hard in the gym. And really my goal with the mini course is to help you understand how you work with this population to get them out of pain and keep them training. The next lesson is 7 reasons why people get hurt in the gym. So it's vitally important they understand the injury mechanisms or why people get hurt in the gym. If we don't understand why folks are getting hurt in the gym, it's going to be very hard to rehabilitate those folks because let's say we do get them better, they go right back in the gym and get hurt in the same exact way they hurt before. The other piece is if we want to keep these folks safe for the long haul, we have to understand the main reason why these folks get hurt in the first place so we can keep them in the gym training as safe as possible and minimize that risk of future injury. Next, we go over 4 simple steps for getting your clients out of pain. Now, rehab can be very complicated. There's a lot of systems out there that make it very challenging to figure out how to work with your patients. However, it really doesn't have to be that complicated. So I go over 4 easy steps you can follow to get your patients out of pain and back in the gym where they belong. Lesson number 4 is how to build the career of your dreams and earn the respect of your community. Let's face it, the reason why you take these educational courses is obviously so you can learn a little bit more, but really the deep-seated reason is because you want to have the respect of your community. You want your clients to come in, work with you and say, wow, Joe was great. He did a phenomenal job with me. Tell their friends, and their friends come to see you. And after a while, you're very valued and respected within your community. So I'm going to teach you how to do that. The second piece is that if you know these skills, it doesn't always mean you have a ton of patients going through the door so you can work with the population you want to work with, right? So you may be the absolute best coach in the world, but no one wants to come and see you because they don't know who you are and they don't know how good you actually are. So we'll teach you how to get the patients through the door that you want to work with. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the Fitness Pain-Free certification. This is the largest and most comprehensive educational course that I offer, but more on this later. So I'll leave a link in the description, in the show notes. Again, it's 100% free, really easy to download. Go ahead and do that right now.
What do you think? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like you're creating ladders of exercises that can help those individuals go from step 1 to step 2.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ladders next? Because we're kind of there.
Seems like it, man.
Yeah. So basically, I guess I'll kind of, in the book, we talk a lot about these exercise modification ladders, right? And generally speaking, one of the risk factors for having an injury in the future is a previous injury, but an even stronger risk factor is having a current injury, right? And this is a study that I took called Do Niggles Matter? And they were looking at soccer players, right? Football, if you're from outside the United States. And essentially, these folks had non-time loss injuries. And all that means is that these folks weren't pulled out from practice or game situations, but they were injured, right? So it's kind of a minor injury. And what they looked at was that, does this lead to a time loss injury or a more serious injury that forces you to sit out? And shocker, it did, right? At a very, very high rate, right?
Mhm.
More so than the acute to chronic workload ratio, which is one of the things we kind of consider as a gold standard in the physical therapy world for what actually produces an injury over the course of time. So we've all done this before. Like, Dean, I'm guessing you've done this before, right? Your back's not feeling great. You're going in, you're like, you know what? I want to hit 400 for 5. I've been dreaming about this set for the past week. I really want to get it. I know my back doesn't feel good, right? Go in there, you warm up. And what I will say, sometimes you get through it and your back feels okay, right? Sometimes you get halfway through it and your back feels terrible and you have to stop, right? So I think it comes back to this idea of risk and making smarter decisions when you're in the gym. So if you're not feeling great and we're kind of trying to work through one of these minor aches and pains, the risk of injury is just higher, right? Can you survive? Of course you can. People survive all the time, but sometimes they don't make it. So one of the ideas behind these exercise modification ladders, which we put a lot of these into the book, I really like these a lot. I use them with all my patients, is that when you're injured, there's 2 things we want to do. One, we want to keep getting jacked, right? We still want to work towards our training goals. We want to build muscle and build strength. But 2, we got to respect the injury, because if we just like shoot the middle finger, load the bar up and go, there's a chance that we just get hurt, right? So what we probably need to do is try to play with fire again, find that right dose. I tell my patients, it's kind of like when you're taking aspirin. You take 2 aspirin, gets rid of your headache. You take the whole bottle, not doing so well. You're probably not training that after 3, right? So it's not the aspirin, it's a problem, it's the dosage. So what we're trying to do is alter that dosage a little bit so we continue working towards our training goals, not hurt our low back, right? Or our knees or whatever other area, right? Just go on this idea of the low back with deadlifting. There's a variety of things we can do. So for one, you can reduce the loads, add a bit of a tempo. You can increase the rep and reserve or reduce the RPE, right? So that perceived intensity goes down. You can still get a decent training effect. You can also change the exercise. So you can go from something like a conventional barbell deadlift to maybe an elevated barbell deadlift, or maybe go to a trap bar where you can allow the knees to travel forward. Like Dean said, take some of the strain off the hips and the low back and place it on the quads, right? That's not working. Maybe you do a single-legged deadlift, because you have 2 legs and 1 spine. When you do a single-legged deadlift, the legs become the limiting factor and the back is no longer the limiting factor. So it might feel a little bit better, right? Any thoughts on those ladders? Anything that you would add, Dean?
Yeah, and like I was saying before, like, you can make the exercises whatever you want them to be. And the cool thing is that it all produces results one way or another. It's just stress on the body. It's an input looking for an output. So the exact tool doesn't necessarily always matter as long as you're able to produce the outcome that you're looking for. So if I don't want to do a conventional deadlift off the floor, but I want to do a conventional deadlift off rack pull, I'm getting a similar stress. Is it the same? No, it doesn't need to be. But if I'm a client who has a sore or cranky back and I'm like, well, I still want you to deadlift today, and that's a variation that allows them to train to a relatively decent intensity where they feel they're getting a training effect, we're seeing the progress that we want to, we don't need to pull off the floor. I'm a big believer that if there is a movement that absolutely has to be done, then it has to be done. If I'm a power lifter, I have to squat, I have to bench, I have to deadlift 2 specific standards. If I'm an Olympic lifter, same thing. I have to clean and jerk and I have to snatch 2 specific standards. If I'm involved in high rocks, if I'm involved in CrossFit, those have competition level goals that you have to be involved in. But if I'm not in those competitions and I don't have those specific outcomes, then I can choose what I want to do based on what the goal outcomes are on the stress management. So if I have a soccer player or a football player, the goal is for them to be on the pitch. The goal is for them to be in the game. I don't care about what the tools we use in the gym, as long as we're able to get the stress appropriate that they can get back out into the game and play. If they're not playing, they're not making money. They're not doing the thing they're supposed to do. They're not living the goal that they want to do. So the tool itself in the gym is irrelevant. It's just about what's the outcome that we're looking for, and then what tool can we use to get that person that outcome in their current situation.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think you brought up some good points. One of which is that, let's say you're not like a world-class athlete, you don't necessarily have to deadlift or do something that's really close to a deadlift. You could just do something that works the lower body a little bit. And the next day when you feel a bit better, maybe go back to deadlifting or starting to work your way back up again. If you're a world-class power lifter and you have a competition coming up, sometimes that's a little bit different. So one of the things I will try to do for these folks is try to give them the modification that most closely resembles what they're supposed to do on that day without aggravating the area. Now, I'm a licensed physical therapist, so I can make these decisions a little more so with my patients. I would recommend, if you're dealing with an injury currently, you go work with someone to kind of figure this out. But largely, I try to keep the modification that allows folks to train as close as possible to what the lift is supposed to be for that day without going above, about a 4 out of 10 pain wise, and without causing compensation. So I don't want them to corkscrew their back in a funky way just so they can lift without pain. The next day, you should be kind of back to your baseline. So whatever you can do to keep folks working towards their goals and then also respect that injury is a positive. And the thing I try to kind of get folks to wrap their head around, which I think is important, is that if you choose a really good modification, you're actually choosing a good rehab exercise. Because like Dean said, your body heals and adapts via stress and strain. So if we want it to get better, we have to apply the right dosage of that. So if we find that right modification, we're rehabbing while we're actually training. So it's a pretty cool match made in heaven, right?
It's huge. And I've always told people that strength training is corrective by itself, and that you can see a lot of really cool things happen when you get just a little bit stronger. I mean, I've got a lot of clients that come into me who've got a lot of postnatal problems, a lot of female organ prolapse type stuff, or like pubic issues or stuff like that. And as soon as we start getting them stronger, a lot of those issues tend to manage themselves to a certain degree. And it's not something where it's like, okay, you know, day one, you've never touched weight before, YOLO, we're going to rip a bar off the floor. But we're going to work on bracing. We're going to work on pressure management. We're going to build up the strength of the muscles involved and get you to a point where you can safely do these things. With clients that have shoulder injuries or back injuries or anything like that, we get them a little bit stronger and things seem to manage themselves in a lot of ways. So we can do a lot of things from a treatment side of things, but then we still have to be actively involved in that process.
Okay. Good stuff. Like it, Dean. So I want to talk a little bit about recovery. You already chit-chatted about this a little bit. We do have some very interesting data showing that the amount of strain someone is under in terms of stress, like psychological stress, does correlate with injury, which I think is super interesting. The amount of sleep that folks get, the consistency that they have with their sleep is also important. Also has some data in bone stress injuries that diet is very, very important too. I'm just hoping that more research comes out over the course of time showing nutrition is important. Now, you kind of mentioned recovery being something that's going to dictate how much you press. And you also talked about a training journal. How do you dictate how much stress or training to throw at your athletes? And when do you kind of pull back based on these recovery things that we're talking about?
So perfect segue story to bring up at this. One of my clients just finished up his residency in orthopedic surgery. And immediately after he wrote his last exam, his body kind of fell apart. And he'll tell you this in his own way too. It's like, man, he emails me. He's like, my back is sore, my hips are sore, my shoulders sore. I can't sleep. I don't know what's going on. So he's like, do you think there's anything exercise-wise we can do? I was like, well, come in, let's see what's going on. We go through just basic orthopedic testing, and he knows this as much as anyone else because this is what he does. And we're looking at things, we're kind of collaborating on it. I'm like, does this hurt? No. What do you think about this? What do we do here? I'm happy if he is the patient, but at the same time, he's a client and he's also the doctor all at once, right? So he knows what we're doing. He knows what we're going through. And he's like, try doing this, try doing that. We do all these tests and nothing's coming up. So there's no injury there, but he's got all these pains, tightnesses, everything like that. So I'm like, all right, let's try something out. He walks up and down the track and he's limping, he's sore, he's tight, everything like that. He comes back, we do box breathing. Breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. We do about 10 of those. And then we do just some positional movements, just some very gentle type stuff. Nothing too crazy while focusing on inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Walks up and down the track, no limp, no problem, just moving easy. He's like, wow, I feel so much better. I'm like, yeah, there's a psychosomatic response that your body just went through. You just went through one of the biggest exams of your life, and your body was just like, holy crap, what do I do with all of this? I don't know what's happening. And he had a body reaction to it. Stress plays huge roles in people. He hadn't trained, he hadn't been doing anything, but his body was like, something is wrong, danger alert, we got to set up all the metrics. And we were able to get him to relax a little bit with some breathing and a couple of positional drills, and easy. He feels great. It took him about 2 weeks to settle down after he wrote that exam to get to a point where we could actually train and see a training response again. without his body being like, nope, throw up the barriers, throw up the signs, throw up everything going wrong. So yeah, psychology and stress play a huge role in how your body feels pain. So with a
Yeah.
lot of my clients, it's like, okay, how are you feeling today? And when they come into the gym, if I can look in their eyes and say, okay, you look tired, you look stressed, you look like you're on edge, you look like you're doing all of this, we might have to modify and adapt the program. Some days they come in, they're like, I just got off a transcontinental flight about 3 hours ago. I'm jet lagged like crazy. I don't know what we'll do. And they hit like 6 PRs in the gym that day. I don't know. It just happens, right? But some days we use warm up and build up sets to gauge what's going on. And at the warm up, they're maxed out and they're
Mhm.
just not going to progress beyond that. So it's like, all right, we're going to do what Tony Gentilcore calls punch the clock workouts. We're going to show up, we're going to do what we can, and then we're going to get out of the gym and go home and sleep. That's it. We're going to find what your trainable menu is. We're going to figure out what you can do today. I might have had a plan listed up, but I'm going to toss that plan out. We're going to do something entirely different because the plan isn't going to work for you today. You don't have any of the raw ingredients to make that nice steak cookie.
Mhm. I had a coach at, I was a pole vaulter back in high school and college. And I had a coach that had a statement I used to love because some days you just don't have it. You go to the gym, you just feel like it was a waste of your time, right? Coach say, yeah, don't worry about it. Go home, eat some pizza, come back tomorrow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes you have days like that, right?
Yeah. Can you
Um,
imagine those workouts after midterms or after finals?
oh, terrible.
They were not
Um,
happening.
Yeah, I am stealing this directly from a coach named is Jason Lyden. He works with a lot of CrossFit athletes, but essentially he talks about the amount of stress your body can handle in one day as a bank account. Let's say you have like 1,000 units to withdraw, and you can withdraw by exercising, right? Let's say you have a really tough workout, that's 600 units. But then let's say you have traffic in the morning, that's another 100. Come home from work and your kid is sick, like that's another 200. Don't sleep that night. Now your bank account gets smaller, right? Recovery is worse. Don't eat. Bank account got even worse. And all of a sudden
Hmm.
you're overdrafting from this account and you're more likely to get hurt. So I do think it's wise to have folks think about how much stress is going on with their life, right? So when they go into that workout, and this is problematic because some folks, when they're super stressed out, all they want to do is crush the weights, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes this can be nice and a good stress relief, but sometimes it might end up in an injury. So I like what you had said. Don't walk into the gym and just expect it to be terrible. Warm up, see how you feel, see how the weights feel when they go on your back, listen to your body. Is anything hurting? Maybe you back off that day, but you don't expect to just, drop everything because it's going to be terrible. And sometimes ends up being just fine. You do great, right? But I do think
Hmm.
that I like that idea of moving slowly, see how you feel. If you don't have it, punch the clock, get through it. These workouts are important. And then maybe afterwards, if this becomes a chronic issue, like everybody has bad days, but if you're having bad day after bad day after bad day, maybe you should manage some of the stress in your life. Maybe you need to sleep a little better. Maybe you need to take a look at this diet, right? Peel back the curtain, see what we need to change. So, yeah, good points
Absolutely.
there.
And that's a concept of autoregulation that we jump into in the book too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. You had already mentioned a little about journaling. That's really what I like to do too. But how do you go about auto regulation via journaling for you, Dean? What do you like to do?
Biggest thing is just keeping track of what you actually do and then make a couple of notes in the sidebar as far as like how heavy that felt, how intense that was. And then maybe at the bottom, what do you feel like today? Do you feel fast? Do you feel sluggish? Do you feel like the weight just moves at a glacial pace? Do you feel like you just want to get into your emotions and listen to Taylor Swift all day? Like what's going on in the world that is maybe changing what you're doing in the gym? And if you're able to start noticing patterns with it, where it's like, okay, I noticed last week I had a huge volume week, and then my bar started getting slower, my weight started feeling heavier, I started feeling in my feelings and my emotions, and you felt like Drake after Kendrick Lamar. It's not a good scene, right? So then we got to be able to say, okay, well, maybe that volume was just at the upper end or maybe just beyond what you can tolerate. Adjust your volume down a little bit. And if you start saying, yeah, every workout, feeling good, feeling snappy, feeling powerful, everything's awesome. Okay, cool. We might have found your ideal volume, but it could also be stuff outside of the gym. Maybe you're not sleeping as much as normal. Maybe you've been partying a bit too much. Maybe it was Christmas time and you were having too many alcoholic beverages. That gives you an idea of, okay, well, these things are affecting you in these ways. And it doesn't have to be like you track every piece of data, but it's just making a note to be like, you know what, I haven't been sleeping that well lately. And I notice in my training that that's been affecting me. I haven't been eating as clean as I would normally eat before, and I can see what's happening in my training. You don't have to
Mhm.
be recording everything, but as long as you're looking at it and being able to appreciate the patterns when they start popping up, you can make some decisions about your training. So that way, when the next workout calls for 10 sets of three in a small off circuit, you'll be able to say, you know what, when I've tried that, I really hate my life. And so maybe I'm going to do like 7 sets of 3 instead of 10, just to be able to give myself that volume break.
Mm-hmm. I like it. All good information. I do think you can get super granular with those training journals. And I think keeping it simple is very important. One of the research studies we talk about in the book was looking at stress on a graph and a scale of 0 to 3. Essentially, you go into the gym and you write down how stressed out you feel on a scale of 0 to 3. And if it was higher on the high stress level, folks were more likely to get hurt, right? So you can do that. And I kind of call this like a readiness score. How ready do you feel? How stressed out do you feel? You can just kind of rank how you feel. I also think it's a good idea just to track how much sleep you've had. So if you're being consistent, that's a good sign that you're really refilling up the tank over the course of time. And if you have one night where you don't do well, maybe you have to back off slightly with your training. Maybe not so much, but certainly if you're having night after night after night, you're not sleeping well, that becomes a big problem. You can also count your calories. You're getting in the nitty gritty, and a lot of folks aren't going to want to do this, but I want to have an idea of how much I'm eating on a consistent basis, and not eating enough, I might not be earning the ability to do those tough workouts. Now, this is going to depend on the individual. Like a lot of folks are just basically trying to maintain or lose a little bit of weight. So if they're losing weight, great. But if you're one of those folks that's just working very, very hard in the gym, maybe you're a CrossFit athlete, not eating enough, then you're probably going to run into some injury problems as a result. So I do recommend tracking that and just making sure over the course of time that you're being consistent, right? And that can be a lot, but I think it will reap a lot of rewards for you over the course of time in terms of less injuries and also better consistent progress too, you know?
Huge. A lot of people need to approach their training like they're a professional athlete. So if you're a professional at what you do, you should be willing to put in a little bit of diligence to be like, okay, well, what am I actually doing? What goes into this programming? What goes into this plan? And how do I get more out of it? So if it's important enough to you that you're willing to focus on spending however many hundreds of dollars to come see Dan to fix your shoulder, maybe figure out what's going on with your shoulder and what's going into all that kind of stuff to begin with, to make sure that you don't have to keep spending that money. Treat your shoulder the way you're supposed to, and take advantage and take ownership of your life as you need to make sure that you can get yourself into those situations more than just the once a week or once every 2 week sessions with Dan, or training with me every 2 or 3 times a week to get you into that tip top shape. All the other stuff outside of the gym plays this huge role in as everything that happens in the gym.
Or maybe you do keep hurting yourself so that I can go on vacation, buy that new car. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you got to hurt him a little bit, Dean.
Gotta hurt him a little bit, yeah.
Then send him my way. Yeah.
This is all just a big grift. I beat them up, you fix them up, and send them back to me.
For sure. Yeah. One of the concepts we talk a little bit about in the book, and you already mentioned this, is psychology, right? Also have some pretty interesting data about psychological profiles. And when I read through this study, I was basically like, this makes sense. We see these folks all the time, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So you see these folks that have a very high athletic identity, or their sense of self is really wrapped up in being an athlete or a power lifter or someone who just really loves training, right? And these folks also tend to have a sense of perfectionism. So they want to finish their workouts or just keep working until they get it done, right? When they have an injury, they're going to be less likely to listen to their bodies. And they basically use denial as a coping mechanism. Like, it's not that bad. I'll get through the workouts. And they just keep on doing that over the course of time. I guess my question for you, Dean, is how do you deal with these folks that are just like, can't get out of their own way? Their ego is too big. They just can't stop pushing, and they keep getting hurt as a result.
Yeah. And part of it is like, I'm in that mindset too. Like, I've always been in that process where it's like, can I push through this? Can I keep going? If coach was to come over and look at me and say, can you go? I'd be like, yep. Even if I knew I couldn't, I would still find a way to get on the floor, which is probably why my athletic career never went anywhere. I was always injured. So I understand and I relate to these people, but at the same time, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, what is their motivation to that? If I lay out a plan that has these exercises in it, but that's just a framework, and I'm able to say, okay, I might change this over here, I might cut this back over here, but they're like, no, we have to do this. It's like, no, I made the program. You do what I tell you to do, right? So it's not necessarily just like, well, here's the program and I'm divorced of the program that I wrote. It's here's my framework and here's what I'm going to tell you to do. And here's my recommendations as we go forward. So part of it is making sure you have those conversations where it's like, yeah, if I give you this list of stuff to do and you don't do it, I'm not firing you. I'm not kicking you off the team. I'm going to show you a better way of doing things as we get going based on information you're giving me as we go into things. And a lot of it comes back to trust too. Do they trust you that you will adjust things based on their best interests rather than just filling their ego bucket? So we have to have those conversations where it's like, I'm here for you. I'm here to make sure that you get the best outcome on this. If I tell you to do something different, there's a reason behind it. I need you to trust me enough to follow that recommendation. And most of the time they do. I'm also in a situation where I can pick and choose my clients effectively. So if I tell a client to do something and they're not willing to do it, okay, I've got 3 other people waiting to train with me. So if you don't want to follow what I'm trying to tell you and you keep getting injured and you're not willing to listen to what I'm telling you to do, maybe they'll follow what I'm trying to tell you to do, right? But
Yeah, kick them
so I
out.
can kind of lean on them a little bit if I need to, but I don't
Yeah.
want to do that because I want to make sure the clients I'm working with get results. So usually we have to communicate back and forth a little bit to be able to come to an understanding as far as why I would say, okay, I wrote down 5 sets here, but we're only going to do 3 sets today. What's the reason behind that? And can I get buy-in from that individual to make sure that they understand why I'm doing that?
Yeah, I think that's really important because a lot of these folks, they just want to get better, right? It's a good coping mechanism. So essentially, these folks learn that the harder they work, right, the more time, the more
Hmm.
effort they put in, the more they become a perfectionist, the more they become a better athlete, right?
Yeah.
You don't really want to stomp that because that's
Yeah.
beneficial for sport, but you also want to make sure they're not overdoing it. And I think sometimes trying to have that conversation of you're actually getting worse by doing too much
Yeah.
is helpful because at least they can wrap their head around the idea of like, oh, I'm doing this because I want to get better, but I'm actually making myself worse. So I'm doing the opposite. And that
Yeah.
is hard because some people just like to work hard and like they can't actually consume that information and listen to you, right? They don't want to hear it. So that becomes more challenging.
And these are
Um,
people who also become highly successful in their lives by outworking everyone else around them. So for you to tell them, yeah, back off on this, they're like, I don't understand what that means. And when you
mhm.
say it's for like injury prevention and health and maintenance, they're like, I don't understand what any of that means. I'm a performance oriented individual. What are you talking about 20 years from now? I'm worried about putting this weight up right now in this moment. I can't
Yeah.
think 20 years down the line, right?
Yeah. That is tough, but I think at the very least, giving them options where they can push, right? So if it's
Yeah.
like, all right, well, I can't deadlift 500 pounds conventional today. Can we do a rack pull? Can we do a trap bar? Can we do something that's actually going to push you forward? Because I think what ends up happening is that if they do press through that pain, because they feel like they need to, next week they're weaker because they
Hmm.
created more pain. So if we can kind of get them on board with, okay, let's not do this, but we'll do something that's equally as effective or similarly equally as effective, maybe not exactly the same, but it'll allow you to live to fight another day so that 3 weeks from now, you'll be able to actually PR at the meet, right? As opposed
Hmm.
to not being able to go to the meet because your hip is killing you at this point, your knee, your low back, whatever else it is. So it's pretty good. All right. I
Totally.
know they don't have you for very much longer. I want to ask you if you have any key takeaways for lifelong training. Keep making those gains. Don't get hurt.
Yep. Biggest thing is to find what you love and let it consume you. Figure out a way to do what you enjoy doing. If you can find something that you enjoy doing, the process becomes so much easier. Now, that might be something outside of the gym. It might be going for hikes. It might be going for bikes. It might be playing golf. It might be pickleball. It might be whatever you do. So, when you do those kind of sports and you really enjoy them, you can't wait to do them again. Now, if you enjoy doing them well enough, do the strength training to support them. Do the stuff that you know is going to be necessary to maintain mobility, maintain tissue adherence and compliance, to make sure that when you play those sports, you can get as much enjoyment out of them as possible. And then make sure that when you're training, you're thinking, well, maybe max effort isn't for me today. Maybe it's something where if I do a little bit every day, that adds up over time. There's a time to push and a time to be like, you know what, middle ground is probably good enough for most of the time that you're training, unless you're trying to compete. Then you have to push the numbers higher. But the higher you stress the body, the higher the rate of injury. The higher the rate of injury, the higher the rate of future injury. So manage stress, manage intensity, find the stuff you love to do, and do it as much as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dean. And then before we go, I just want to say if you like the concepts we talked about today, we made a whole book about this. It's Rock Solid Resiliency. It's coming out soon, February 28th. You can actually pre-order it now, Amazon.com. I'll put a link in the description, and I'll also leave a link in the description for an excerpt on the book. So if you want to learn more about it and also to be notified when it is live on February 28th, I'll put another link in the description. Go ahead and click on that one. And you can check out the book and you can check out the expert or excerpt. Wow. Or the expert, Dean Somerset. Well, thank you again, Dean, for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And
My
I'll
absolute
get
pleasure.
you. What's that?
I said my absolute pleasure, man.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. It's should have had you on here earlier. Obviously, we have a good reason for now, but hopefully you'll see you again in the future. So thank you, man.
You bet. Take care.
If you're watching this on YouTube, please, please, please hit that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy this. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, please give me a 5 out of 5 rating. It helps tremendously. And lastly, if you want to go that next step and support me further, consider subscribing to Fitness Pain Free Insiders. So Insiders is like Netflix for physical therapists and coaches working with painful folks in the gym. You've got access to 100 plus webinars, ebooks, and courses. More recently, I've been taking all of my best content from YouTube. I've been taking out all the ads. I've been organizing it in a really step-by-step fashion in an entire course so you can easily go through it. And I add additional pieces to this to enhance your learning, right? So I just finished up my lateral ankle sprain course. And one of the big things I added to this was a protocol. So essentially, what do you do week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, 6, 7, 8? You know me, I like working with athletes. I like working with really fit and strong people. So it's going to be a lot more robust than your typical protocol. Also, you have access to me. So inside of Insiders, you can leave a comment and I'll get right back to you. I also have physical therapy CEUs inside of Insiders. So if you take the course Essential Coaches Series, get a bunch of CEUs. And what's even better is you can start for just $1. After that, it's $25 per month. It's going to be the cheapest CEUs you can get. It's by far the highest value program that I offer at the cheapest price. So head over to fitnesspainfree.com, click on the program's link, and then click on Fitness Pain Free Insiders to get started. I'll also leave a link in the show notes where you can check it out.